There's magic in simplicity. A rainy night, a good story, and a warm voice, that's all you need. Before we begin, click like if this is your kind of calm, and subscribe for more sleepy escapes. Do you remember the last bedtime story someone read to you? There was always a chair in the far corner of our living room, a wide, low armchair with worn wooden arms and a seat that gave just enough to remember the shape of whoever had last sat there. It didn't match anything else in the room. The other furniture was newer, shinier, picked out by my mother with catalogs and measurements, but the chair stayed. It had always been there, they said, and it belonged to my grandfather. He wasn't the kind of man who filled space with sound. He had a soft way of being present, quiet, but unmistakable. Most evenings, especially in the colder months, he'd settle into that chair right after dinner. Not with drama, not with any kind of announcement. He'd simply walk over, tug at the edge of his sweater, and lower himself slowly, like the act of sitting was part of a long, familiar ceremony. He didn't talk much once he sat. Sometimes he'd read old newspapers, yellowed at the edges, or just rest with his hands folded on his stomach, watching whatever was on TV without really watching. I'd sit nearby on the floor with my toys, or lie back on a cushion and sneak glances at him, trying to figure out what he was thinking. He rarely caught me looking, but when he did, he'd give me the smallest nod, not to say hello, not even to invite conversation, just to let me know he saw me. I think, even then, I understood that this was his way of saying he cared, not with words, but with stillness. The chair became a part of him in my mind, not just a place he sat, but a space where he was. It smelled faintly of tobacco and wool and something older I never could name. And even when he wasn't in it, the room felt like he might return at any moment. After he passed quietly, in the middle of a night with soft rain tapping the windows, the chair stayed. My mother left it untouched for weeks. No one dared move it. There was something sacred about it now, something that made the room feel steadier. And even though I was still young, I'd find myself drifting over to it without meaning to, not to sit, but just to be near it, to rest my hand on its arm, or to lean my head against its back, like I was trying to absorb whatever had once lived in its fabric. I didn't understand grief yet, but I understood the silence he left behind. And I understood more than anything how much love can live in the corners of a room, quiet, unmoving, and completely alive. It must have been winter, though I can't say which year, only that the windows had fogged over by late afternoon, and the air inside the house carried that deep, slow stillness that only seems to arrive when everything outside has gone quiet under a sky full of snow. My grandfather was already in his chair by the time I came back in from the cold, my cheeks still red, gloves damp from packing snow into something that never quite became a snowman. He didn't say anything as I entered, just looked over, gave me that gentle nod of his, and turned his gaze back to the small fireplace that was more decoration than heat. My mother was in the kitchen, humming to herself while stirring something in a heavy pot. The room smelled like stewed apples and cloves, the kind of scent that seemed to wrap around your shoulders like a blanket. I took off my boots and sat on the carpet near his chair, close enough to feel his presence, far enough to keep the unspoken rule of his space. For a while, we said nothing. I played idly with a small plastic car in my lap, rolling it back and forth, listening to the soft scrape of rubber wheels on worn fibers. At some point, he reached down beside the chair and pulled out a folded newspaper, the kind that always looked like it had already lived a full life before reaching our house, creased, yellow at the folds, the ink faded in places. He didn't read it aloud, just scanned the pages with that slow, deliberate pace I now think of when I imagine patience. I watched him more than the toy in my hand, the way he adjusted his glasses, scratched his chin, leaned ever so slightly to the left, as if settling deeper into memory. I don't know how long we stayed like that, an hour maybe, or less, but it felt like time thinned out around us, stretched by the quiet and the warmth of the room. At one point he cleared his throat and said, "More to the air than to me. It'll be a long snow this year." I remember looking at him, not sure if he was predicting the weather or telling me something else. I didn't ask. I just nodded, mimicking the gesture he so often gave me. And in that moment, something passed between us, not information, but understanding. I didn't know, back then, that we were building the kind of memory that would live in me for decades. That the chair I leaned against would one day become mine. That the silence we shared would grow louder in meaning the older I got. I only knew that I felt safe, held, and that in the hush of that winter room, with snow pressing gently against the window panes and the scent of apples in the air, love was something you could sit inside, quietly, and let it teach you how to stay still. I didn't expect to take it, the chair. It wasn't something I asked for, or even thought about much after I moved out, packed my life into boxes, and began learning how to live in places that didn't yet smell like home. It had stayed there, in the corner of my mother's living room, untouched for years. People sat in it, sometimes guests, mostly, but never for long. It had a gravity to it, like a quiet monument. And then one weekend, I came back to help her clear out the house before she moved. She was downsizing, she said. Something smaller, quieter. We walked through each room, sorting objects into piles. Keep, give away, maybe. When we reached the living room, she ran her hand along the arm of the chair, more like a gesture than a thought. "You should take this," she said, not looking at me. "If you want it." I didn't answer at first. I just stood there, feeling the pull of 1,000 moments layered into the cushions, the weight of evenings, of silences, of a man who rarely spoke but always made his presence known. "Okay," I said eventually. That was it. No ceremony, no deep moment, just a quiet yes. We wrapped it in an old blanket, the same one he used to nap under, and slid it into the back of my car. It looked strangely small there, as if it had shrunk now that it was no longer anchored in its corner. I drove home in silence, the scent of its fabric, faint tobacco, worn wool, something like dust and memory curling through the air. In my apartment, I placed it near the window where the afternoon light softened into gold, and for a while I just let it sit there, untouched. I didn't rush to make it part of the room. I think I needed to let it settle first to see if it would still feel like his chair or if it had now become mine. Over time, it found its place. I'd sit in it after work, legs folded, a book in hand, or just staring out the window, letting the quiet of the day collect in my chest. I noticed how I leaned to the same side he once did, how I sometimes folded my hands across my stomach the way he used to. Not to imitate him, just because it felt right, like the chair was gently teaching me how to be still again. And I realized then that the chair had never really belonged to him or to me. It belonged to a rhythm, a way of being, a quiet that doesn't need explaining, a presence that sits beside you, even when the room is otherwise empty. It had carried him. Now it carried me. And in its worn-out fabric, I felt something I hadn't known I'd missed, not just him, but the way time used to move when he was here. It happened one evening without invitation, the way real memories often return not as a story I meant to recall, but as a feeling first, rising quietly while I sat in the chair, the room dim except for the soft lamp by the shelf and the last bit of dusk folding gently into the corners. I hadn't planned to sit there long. I had emails to write, dishes waiting in the sink, something half-watched paused on the screen, but instead I just sat, legs curled beneath me, arms resting on the worn wooden sides like I used to when I was small, and before I knew it, the light in the room had changed and something inside me had opened. What returned wasn't dramatic, no moment of revelation. Just a small scene from a late afternoon years ago when I was maybe 7 and it had rained all day. The kind of steady, curtain-like rain that makes the whole world quieter. I had been restless, tapping my fingers against the window, sighing in that performative way children do when they want someone to fix the weather. My grandfather was in his chair, same as always, reading the same newspaper he probably read every day. At some point he looked up and said simply, "Come sit." I remember hesitating. He wasn't someone you climbed on, not like a big soft uncle or a playful older cousin, but something in his voice, not command, not invitation, just room made me obey. I climbed into the chair beside him, wedging myself into the small space between the arm and his side, where the cushion still carried his shape. He didn't say anything more, just kept reading. And for the first few minutes I stayed tense, unsure if I was supposed to talk or sit or do nothing at all. But gradually, the rhythm of the rain and the soft rustle of paper lulled me into stillness. I leaned my head against his arm, and he shifted just slightly to make space, without words, without fuss. That was the entire memory, no big lesson, no final sentence, just the feeling of being allowed to exist next to someone in absolute peace. And now, sitting in the chair all these years later, I could feel it again. The weight of his sweatered arm, the smell of the pages, the particular creak the chair made when he adjusted his footing, and I understood, with a depth that only adulthood gives you, that what he gave me in that moment was a kind of early blueprint for love, not the loud kind, not the kind that declares itself, but the kind that makes space, quietly, and lets you rest. It took me years to realize how rare that is. And even now, in a world that feels too fast, too loud, too certain of itself, I find myself returning to that one small rainy afternoon when the only thing I needed to be was near. When someone saw I didn't know what to do with myself, and without fixing or teaching or explaining, simply said, "Come sit," and meant it. It wasn't something I noticed in the moment, not consciously, but looking back now, I can see how it happened, how I began to carry his presence into the lives around me without meaning to, without trying to be anything other than what felt natural in the small, quiet spaces of the day. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, years after the chair had come home with me, the kind of slow gray day where time loosens its grip and the world hums at a softer volume. My friend's daughter, a girl of about 6, was visiting with her parents, restless from being indoors, hopping between cushions, asking questions without waiting for answers, tugging at attention like children do when they haven't yet learned the rhythm of boredom. I was sitting in the chair with a book I hadn't read more than a few pages of, more for the feeling of holding it than for the story inside. She came over suddenly, her energy still bouncing around the room, and without much thought said, "Can I sit?" I looked up and nodded, not in the way adults sometimes do when they mean not now, but the way my grandfather once did, soft, open, without conditions. She climbed into the chair beside me, small limbs folding like a question mark, and I adjusted just slightly, not to make it perfect, but to make room. We didn't speak. I didn't tell her a story or ask what she was thinking. I just kept holding the book, even though I wasn't reading it anymore, and after a while, she stilled. Her breathing slowed. The room felt heavier in a good way, like something important had settled into it. Later, her mother told me she'd never seen her daughter sit that quietly with someone who wasn't family, and I just smiled, not quite knowing what to say, because the moment hadn't felt like something I did. It felt like something I'd received and simply passed along. And that's the thing, I think, about the kind of love we inherit without knowing it. It doesn't come in lessons or speeches or advice. It comes in postures, in how we hold silence, in how we let someone be close without needing them to perform for it. I hadn't set out to become the calm I had just remembered, what it felt like to be 6 years old on a rainy day with no place to put my restlessness, and how one small gesture, one chair, one quiet presence had made it okay to stop moving. And so now, without realizing it, I've begun to leave space beside me too. In conversation, in rooms, in life. And I think maybe that's what legacy really is, not the stories people tell about you, but the quiet rhythms that live on in the people who once sat close and listened and felt safe without knowing why. It was later than I usually stayed up one of those nights where the silence of the world feels deeper, almost sacred, like the house is holding its breath with you. I hadn't meant to sit in the chair. I'd been passing through the room on the way to bed, a glass of water in hand, a tired ache behind my eyes, but something in the way the moonlight rested across the fabric made me pause, then sit. I didn't turn on the lamp. The shadows were soft, and the window let in just enough silver to see without really seeing. I rested the glass on the table and leaned back into the chair's familiar shape, letting it catch me like it always had. And then, without effort or design, the words came not aloud, not in a voice I could hear, but in the private way thoughts sometimes carry the weight of prayer. "I miss you," I said, not as a sadness, but as a simple truth. Not a longing for him to return. I had long made peace with the fact that he would not, but a kind of reaching out, a quiet offering into the space that had once held him. I don't know if he heard me or if that matters. The room stayed still. No creaks, no signs. But something in me shifted, like a door had opened inside that didn't need hinges. You'd probably say nothing, I thought. smiling in the dark. "Just give me that nod of yours and go back to your paper." I pictured it clearly, the glasses, the slow turning of the page, the smell of his wool sweater faintly rising with every movement. I realized then that I wasn't just remembering him, I was sitting with him. Not in the past, not in imagination, but here, in this exact moment, in the kind of silence where two people who once shared a life can find each other again without needing a single word. And I knew, deeply and without question, that love doesn't disappear. It changes shape, becomes quieter, lives in corners and fabrics and habits, and the way you breathe when you're finally still. The chair creaked as I shifted my weight, and I felt something warm press behind my ribs, not grief, not even nostalgia, just presence. He was here, in the way I sit, in the way I listen, in the way I make room for silence. I sat like that for a long time, not waiting for anything, just being, letting the darkness wrap around the moment like a blanket, letting the old rhythms return, slow and quiet. And before I rose to go, I whispered something I hadn't said in years. Thank you, not for any one thing, just for the way he had existed, for how that quiet, steady love had never left, but simply waited until I was still enough to feel it again. The next morning was quiet in a different way, not the hush of night, but the kind of soft stillness that only belongs to early sunlight and the slow rhythm of waking alone. I moved through the apartment with bare feet and no intention, the kind of morning where you don't check the time and don't really need to. The light through the window was pale gold, not dramatic, just enough to cast faint shadows along the floor. And there, in the same corner where it always sat, the chair glowed slightly in the warmth of it. I poured myself coffee, held the mug in both hands, and just stood for a while, watching how the sunlight caught the frayed threads along the armrest, how the cushion sloped a little on one side from years of quiet weight. It looked at peace, lived in, like something that had never tried to be more than it was and had never needed to be. I didn't sit right away. I just let the room be itself for a while, the air cool from the night, the quiet broken only by a bird outside the window and the soft creak of floorboards under my step. And then I eased myself down, slowly, like he used to, coffee still in hand, letting the chair receive me in the way only it could. I rested my head against the back and let my eyes close for a moment. There was no deep thought, no sudden realization, no overwhelming wave of emotion, just a kind of peace, the kind that comes when you realize you're not chasing anything anymore. I didn't need the past to come back. I didn't need to become him or even to understand everything he once felt. It was enough to know that somehow, through ordinary time and quiet mornings, and the small inheritance of posture and presence, I had carried him forward. Not in stories I told or photos I framed, but in the shape of my days, in the way I slowed down, in the way I made space for silence. And as the light shifted higher across the floor and the day gently invited itself in, I thought, this is what remains, not memory like a picture, but memory like a rhythm, a way of being in the world, a chair, a pause, a morning that asks for nothing but stillness. I think some things stay with us, not because we hold on tightly, but because they choose to stay quietly, without asking for attention, like a soft hum beneath everything we do. The chair now is simply part of my life. I don't think about it every day. I don't treat it like a shrine or speak to it like a symbol. It's where I read, where I drink coffee on slow mornings, where I rest my elbows when I'm deep in thought. But every now and then, in a certain fold of evening light, or in the way my body settles into its worn frame, I feel it again. Not just the memory of my grandfather, but the presence of something deeper, a rhythm, a kindness, a way of being in the world that asks nothing, proves nothing, but offers everything by simply staying. I think that's the kind of legacy we rarely talk about. Not the loud achievements or the stories that get passed down in big remembered words, but the small things. The way someone moved through a room, how they listened without interrupting, how their quiet made others feel steady. He never taught me how to do that. He never needed to. He was it. And without meaning to, I learned. I learned how to sit with someone and not need them to talk. I learned that silence can be generous. I learned that comfort often comes not in what we say, but in where we choose to stay. And so now, years later, when someone I care about comes to me in grief or confusion or nothing at all, just needing a place to be, I try to offer them the same thing I was once given: room to rest without explanation, a pause, a presence, a place to sit beside someone who understands that love can be quiet, that it can live in a chair and a nod and the way evening light touches a worn cushion. Some days I forget that. We all do. But then I sit down again without trying, and the chair creaks beneath me like it always has. And I remember, you don't have to speak everything aloud to keep it alive. Some things stay simply because they were lived well, and they keep living in us long after we think they've gone.